justify? How would you justify taking in Ukrainian refugees and blocking out this? It is this racialism. And finally, I know I'm running out of time, so I will just upturn this lack of agency and this cultural.
Miss Rita, you have time.
Oh, I have to, okay. So this cultural specificity, as I mentioned to you, as far as the Congo was concerned, this explanation, this cultural explanation for why rape was so rampant. And as a very fine Congolese writer says, that these are colonial constructs, these are colonial projections of what they think is normal. Whereas ask the women who've been raped, what kind of meaning do they make? Are they saying exactly the same thing, that this is normalized cultural behavior? Or are they saying something else? As far as the Afghans were concerned, once again, you had this whole thing about, this level of domestic violence is pretty ordinary. This kind of early marriage, transactional marriage, when these two orphan daughters, their father is poisoned. They fear that, in fact, their uncle poisoned their father because they're sitting on this very wealthy property in the center of Kabul. But they're young women. One of them is 21, the other one is only, she's not even 21, she's about 19 then, and the younger one is 15. And the uncle comes to them and threatens them and says, look, you will have to marry me, because otherwise I'll get rid of you, and I will marry your younger sister. And so she resists him, but he comes to see her, he molests her. She just says he touched me. She never says more than that. And I don't think there was any point in pushing her to say what else. And then she says that she resisted him. She kept refusing. Finally, there was he crashed his, a truck, got a truck to crash into her car. She was injured, but nonetheless, she kept, and her sister turned 17 by then. And then he said, okay, your sister is now old enough. You don't matter. I will marry her and take the property. It's then that she fled and she came to India. But there's no recognition of her refugee status as yet. At the time when we spoke to her, hopefully she had been recognized subsequently after the Afghan guideline, after the UNHCR guideline, but she had not been. But not only that, what were these women doing when they came here? They, in fact, didn't just sit back. They got jobs. They tried to, if they had relatives, of course, that was great. They would be sending them money, but they supplemented that money. They supplemented that money by working. The women that I spoke to were either becoming, one of them became a photographer, another one was translating. They worked with the implementing partners of UNHCR. One worked in a travel agency, all kinds of, I mean, I certainly, and then, you can say, okay, but these Afghan women were literate. They were, and the ones who weren't, they were into catering and so forth. But the Rohingyas, who are often pinpointed as, the women who come from these really conservative patriarchies and who really are helpless and who would not be allowed to do anything. If you look at the women who were in Jammu, now Jammu has got quite depleted in terms of its Rohingya population after the mass arrests and so forth. But at the time when Neha Dikshit, a very fine journalist, did some interviews with the Rohingya women, she found that because some of the women had access to what are called walnut factories in the area, they were able to get jobs. Now, they weren't getting very much. They were doing slave labor, and they were getting a pittance. But that very pittance helped them to have some capacity for developing action, for, in fact, let's call it agency. Now, let's not confuse agency with confrontation. This is And let's try and understand multiple levels of agency. Agency which is actually rooted in the cultural, socio-cultural milieu of the person. You're not going to expect her to become like you and me, but what is she? I mean, she is able to have some capacity to have money of her own or to contribute and therefore have some level of autonomy, of voice. And then we found another woman, there's another woman who Neha interviews, Mumtaz Begum. Mumtaz Begum is only 21 years old. And in fact, it's not Mumtaz whom Neha interviews, it's Mehrunisa, her neighbor, who's 51 years old and who is really looks down upon Mumtaz and says, I don't understand this woman. She paints her nails red. She's coming from a family, a dead family. Her whole family was killed in front of her eyes in Myanmar. She was married. We married her when she came here alone, orphaned. We married her. The man ran away. Instead of mourning and or get we willing to get married again, or be pleading with us to give her some food or whatever. What is she doing? She's painting her nails red. Look at her shack. She has sequins on her door. I mean, beautifully embroidered kachi embroidery with sequins. She has skills, and she knows she has skills. She has a contract with a local boutique. She makes money. That enables her autonomy. I met in Delhi, in Kalindi Kunj colony, quite very desolate area. But Delhi offers opportunities. A lot of the young women were going to school. I met a young woman who was about to sit for her 12th class exams. She spoke very good English. She has dreams. There are possibilities, but there are, of course, also real structural constraints. And her father works as a plumber in a waterworks enterprise, meaning it only functions during the summer. So there is a problem. She does tuition. She, in fact, runs a local school in the Rohingya Basti. She also she travels and gives tuition to richer Rohingya or to others as well. But a lot of this takes away time from her own study. So she is nervous. She says, I want to study medicine. And there's no reason why she shouldn't. She said, I used to come first always. Now I'm slipping because I have so much work to do. But these are not women who lack agency. They have capacity. They need to be invested in. And to talk about them as disempowered, you are not only indulging in a false politics, but you can see why this politics is being pushed, because it is the moral logic of denying them the preferred option of reintegration, sorry, not of integration and resettlement in a third country if they are in a first country of asylum, like India, where they do not want to settle, and or where they cannot settle. It is to make sure that return is their only option, repatriation is their only option, or this level of bare living. So as I mentioned to you, none of these are without their politics. And their politics, and the crisis is of our inability to reverse that politics. But these women are resisting, they are demonstrating agency. And particularly, I feel for the Rohingyas because they are the most vulnerable. And as far as the government is concerned, they regard them as suspects. Now, because they were not able to demonstrate any evidence of their involvement in terrorist activity, today they've changed it by saying, oh, well, they are vulnerable to being recruited by terrorist outfits. You've also, I mean, I don't know how many of you read the headlines, but you would have read our the Prime Minister in an election speech in Jharkhand talks about the the Jharkhand Mukti Morcha encouraging Rohingyas and Bangladeshi refugees to come and take, they don't, he doesn't call them, of course, refugees, he calls them illegal migrants to come, or immigrants to come and, take over all the resources and so forth. And this is part of an election speech. So, and we know that, frankly, there are no, I mean, if you look, Rohingyas are not in Jharkhand. Rohingyas are definitely in Delhi, they are in Hyderabad, they are in Jammu, they are in Haryana, but they are not in Jharkhand. Maybe there are 3, 4, I don't know. Also in Mumbai, they're not in Mumbai. And yet recently there was a headline talking about, these Bangladeshi influx, demographic, and demographic engineering threatened and so forth. So these are all myths. But you can see how they stick, especially because they get massaged by the mainstream media, how they in fact create greater vulnerability for the refugees, and they feed into this politics of the undesirable refugee, and this good refugee, bad refugee. The Tibetans are good refugees, the Rohingyas are undesirable, expendable refugees. I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such detailed and insightful session. I mean, your analysis of refugee subject shapes global responses, and I was really fascinated by the contrast you pointed out in the beginning between the perceptions of European and global South refugees. The session was really incredible. I would like to invite the chair, Professor Patel, for her remarks now.
I think Mr. Manchanda's lecture made me really nostalgic. For me, I was in 10th standard when I saw the poster of a Vietnamese woman in a field where she has a sickle in one hand and a very country-made rifle in another hand. She's looking up. There are tears in her eyes. She has a baby at the back, and the napalm bombs are falling on Vietnamese land. I think it's not only me. Millions of youth all over the world got extremely traumatized by this poster. It was such a powerful thing. I think all mainstream newspapers published it in a front page, and then that also galvanized all of us into action and the Vietnam solidarity. So I think it's a very important. It was both. She was a victim and she had agency, because she was working in the field, and she was also was looking up. She had a gun, and her baby was at her back. So she was trying to defend herself, from the bombing and this thing. But I think this kind of images are very, very important. They played a very important role historically. But I think your analysis about the mainstream media's role in portraying good refugee and bad refugee, and the chauvinism and sectarian ideology that is prevailing. Where I have visited Jaffna immediately after Indian peacekeeping force. This is where my feminist friend Hema Tilke only took me to those places, and the plight of those women. At that time, they were helpless. Many of them must have joined later on as a suicide bomber. We also have a public meeting. We had a Kunan Pushpara, about which now the book has also come out. And we wrote to Prime Minister of that time. It was acknowledged one line, we have received your statement, but our version is the Indian army is very chivalrous, is not capable of doing such things. So they did not believe our findings of mass rape by Indian peacekeeping force in Sri Lanka, as well as for Kunan Pushpara also, it was not accepted by the state. So I think it is not only one party or the other, but I think all of them, when it comes to misogyny and insensitivity to gender-based violence, I think all are the same. I just put all of them in the same bracket. Thank you.
But thank you for emphasizing this, because in a sense, that Vietnamese, that photo, there's one very similar one on Nicaragua too, but it is the reality, and the reality is of this dialectics of victimhood and agency, that they do coexist together. And which is why I think it's important to recognize that vulnerability should not be conflated with victimhood or with passivity and helplessness. But not to deny the vulnerability, because the vulnerability is also very real. And, you know, the construction, or whether it's the visual construction or the conceptual construction of disempowerment of women, or, is often used to push back women, to push out women, to cancel their agency, and especially when politics, when peace processes, when arrangements need to be negotiated.
Right.
And this is where our real battle lies, frankly, our struggle lies, to be able to resist this kind of imagery, this kind of construction, to demonstrate and to do the research to visibilize the agency of women, even in these very, very complex, crisis-ridden situations. And I hope that a lot of the young researchers that have joined will be doing that, because unless we're able to actually foreground this, there will always be this, that, oh, there was some moment, a window of ambivalent empowerment. Now that the conflict is over, the ceasefire is there, the pushback begins. The men come back, take over. Why should the women do? And you get excluded. Unless you're able to demonstrate agency, unless you're able to, in fact, negotiate from informal politics, where women are so active, into formal politics, you will always be pushed back.
And I think Algeria is a classic example, how much they fought against the French colonialism. The moment they came to power, first thing they brought was segregation and Sharia. And those who opposed it, they targeted them and they had to ask for asylum. At least those days they were giving. So our feminist friend Maria May, she
Yeah.
is in France. But yeah, things have changed completely now. It's from frying pan to fire. That is the kind of option 21st century world capitalism is giving to women who are fighting against.
But you know, please also remember that governance practices are also not gender neutral. Our governments are also very, very patriarchal.
Yeah.
And there's this, the new gender report has just come out, edited by, or compiled by
Rita Diwan.
And in which, you know, there is one chapter, I've forgotten who the author is, where they talk about GST. Now you think of GST as really, you know, gender neutral, but you look at what is it that they haven't put any tax on. Sindoor, bangles, things like that, all the things that they are.
But on menstrual pad, they put tax, which is a necessity.
See?
For the sanitary pad, they have put GST.
But sindoor pe nahi, bangles, no. So you can see what kind of woman they are looking for, the you know, the total Shringhar woman. And as far as, well, as you said, menstrual products are taxed.
Yeah. I am uploading a India gender report in the chat box.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now we will open the floor for Q&A session. Participants, you are encouraged to use the raise hand feature on Zoom to ask your questions live, or alternatively, you can type your questions in the Q&A box. I request Devjani Chaudhary ji to ask her question.
Good evening, ma'am. Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes.
Good evening.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, ma'am. And truly, it has been a wonderful session to hear. I mean, I truly had no idea about many of these things which I heard today about the refugee crisis and how women are so badly affected in very many areas. And like you pointed out, participation is definitely protection. I mean, this is something which is a big take from here. The more we participate, the more we come forward, definitely. And of course, formal one, like you said, not the informal way, but in a formal way. Now, question to you is, how can international organizations support refugee women's leadership? Like, how can they bring in these women, refugee women, into leadership? Because unless and until they come in as leaders, I don't think they'll any kind of a major impact will be made. So how do you think these international organizations can play a crucial role? What kind of measures may be taken? Ma'am, if you could just highlight on that. Thank you,
When
ma'am.
when you say international organizations, I think we need to, and if you look at the history of the WPS process, that's the Women, Peace and Security process, and I know that you have already had a lecture on 1325. If you look at that process, you see that there was an alliance between women's collectives, transnational, international, national, regional, as well as the femocrats. And one calls them femocrats, that is the feminists who are working in the international system. Of course, they have to survive in the international system, so it's been quite sanitized. But nonetheless, they worked very hard. And it's these women, because there are femocrats who are in the international organizational system. And they will work with you. They will be your allies. Do not expect a great deal from them. I mean, we may have expected a great deal from UN Women. We may be disillusioned. We may have to look at other fora, look at the CEDAW fora. And also, when you talked about international organizations, if you look at the Radhika Kumaraswamy report, now, of course, at one level, she has always been straddling civil society and the international bureaucracy. Radhika Kumaraswamy has been UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. She was the helmsperson for the 1325 report in 2015. And so there you have very much a focus that is driven from bottom-up civil society, but also factored in by femocrats, by people who were supporters, to talk about the need for humanitarian workers to be more gender sensitized, to in fact look at women's agencies. So you do find that there are a lot of these processes. CEDAW, General Recommendation 30, has a very, very strong component on refugees and the need to recognize the agency of refugee women. So in a sense, we too, on our part, meaning from the civil society part, from the academic part, need to look at what are the enabling possibilities, what kind of alliances we can make with transnational groups, as well as with the international groups. But we shouldn't fool ourselves. Organizations like the UN are very much driven by what states want. They prioritize what state wants. But there are always guerrillas inside these organizations. You work with those guerrillas. And I think we call them femocrats.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I request Sanda Thanji to go on with the question.
Yeah, this is Sanda from Myanmar. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. And my question also a little bit similar that what recently asked, and also you also cover. Like you see that in Myanmar, so as of 11 November, so there are 3.4 million IDP, and also over 200,000 statelets, including Rohingya and Rakhine. So many of them are in the neighboring country, like in Thailand and India. In addition, since many of them are undocumented status, there's also high possibility of like threatening situation, deportation due to the forced conscription by the military. And also, as you see that the military also committing rape as a weapon to women, LGBT, including Rohingya women. In this situation, what would be the promising measures, You also mentioned that CEDAW and 1325 and so on and so forth. Yes, in addition to that, no, we can expect from the international community, including UN. And because I'm really like feeling depressing and also feeling hopeless. So that's why the question is also not only for Myanmar, of course, but also other conflict and fragile country like Myanmar. So thank you so much.
Ma'am, Ms. Sanda, can you introduce yourself and your work?
I'm Sanda. So I'm working in the Asian Institute of Technology in Thailand.
Oh, okay. So I agree with you. The situation is very, very grim. And frankly, but I also know that there is a great deal, and you probably know this much, much better than I do. There is a lot of activism within Myanmar, and particularly amongst the women's group individuals as well as women's collectives. For obvious reasons, they are underground, but there is it's extremely inspiring to hear. I mean, the little bit of information that does come out is very, very inspiring. So one is, of course, the fact that we need to try and support those people in whatever way is possible. You have probably better means of supporting them than us. But the other is, let me just break this up a bit. One is the whole issue of trafficking, and which is very much an issue. I mean, an issue. The fact that a lot of these young girls are being lured on the myth of marriage, or even if it is marriage, eventually they will end up getting trafficked or becoming slave labor and so forth. Now, one of the problems is that because we have securitized, and this is not only India, many countries in this region have securitized our borders. So, and there is no policy, no refugee policy. Even we have a new anti-trafficking bill that is, I think, waiting, probably will go to the Joint Parliamentary Committee because there are real problems with this. But what is it looking at? Because of the absence and the legal precarity in which irregular migration, irregular movements take place, these women are very vulnerable. They're vulnerable to the traffickers or smugglers who are helping them cross borders. They are vulnerable to the border guards because these are securitized borders. And so border guards have huge power. They may or they may not let you in, and they will often it can be transactional. It can just be, pushback, deportation, or can be, as I said, transactional. So at every level, there's vulnerability. And we are moving towards, I mean, they're lovely. There are global trafficking, anti-trafficking conventions and so forth. But let's look at our own law, or the draft bill that's there. It's totally in a carceral, that is, a punitive framework. It victimizes and re-victimizes the victim, the trafficked victim. We know very much. I mean, I know for a fact that one of the refugee women that I had to deal with, 14 years old, in 2021, she was she was taken out of her shelter, obviously in 2012. No, sorry, she was 12 years old when she first was helped by smugglers across the border. She was caught. She was sent to shelter home in Assam, and a couple of years later, why they picked her up to be deported, don't ask me. But they said she would be deported, and she was to, now she said, okay, please don't deport me because I cannot go back there. I have no village left. It's been burnt. I have no family there. I'm an orphan. My parents are in Bangladesh. Send me back there. She appealed to MEA. There was a court case saying, okay, stay the proceedings. But before that could really go into effect, she was frog marched to the border and to be pushed across. As luck would have it, it was COVID time, and the Myanmar authorities said, we're not opening the gates. And she was pushed back, and she's back in the shelter home. Now, she's obviously a trafficking victim. Hamida, who died in a detention center in 19-year-old Hamida, who died in a detention center in Shahzada Bagh near Shaheen Bagh in Delhi. She too had been trafficked. She thought she was going to get married. Instead, when she was being pushed across the border across the Indian border, her parents are in Bangladesh. She was caught by the Railway Protection Authority and a policing authority, and she was sent to a detention center in Delhi. Now, she was alone. She was an orphan. She was 19 years old. When she went, her parents say, and there's a very good news article on her, her parents say that she was fine. But she was denied. These are very unhealthy detention centers. She was denied medical assistance. She kept complaining about a stomachache. We don't even know if she was sexually assaulted or not. I mean, because there are no relatives to plead her case, to go to court or anything. She was killed, but she was obviously a trafficking victim. And yet what is the draft bill saying? That all non-nationals should just be pushed back. Issues of consent are never asked. Issues of the fact that UNHCR has said, please, in the case of a non-national who has been trafficked, do not penalize her. Allow us time to resettle her or go through process. So in a sense, we also, when you say it's hopeless, one is the situation in Myanmar is something that much can be done about if in fact, and even by our government, we have interest there. We have economic interest. We have influence there. We sent our military chief to take part in their parades. So we also have influence there. But that's that requires a different kind of lobbying for us to put pressure on the government, to put pressure on, in fact, the Tatas have interest there, Infosys has interest there, Adani has interest there, all our big industrialists have interest there. Pressure can be put on them. So those are different areas. But as far as, even this issue of the women who are trying to escape, we can maybe do something about the trafficking issue. We, meaning us women who are parts of women's collectives, who write. You can write.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I now request Achula Dalalji to go on with the question.
Good evening, ma'am. My question is my opinion. I just want to share. It's like last week when I was having a conversation with a team of Bangladesh bureaucrats, we got to know about the Rohingyas problem together with the so many problems they have been facing, and they have been sharing. It's like out of the total population of Rohingyas, earlier it was 1 lakh, but in a time to pass, because of this, either of unsafe sex or as we were discussing, different unknown rape victims, incidents, or many more, the population has now been increasing from 20,000 to 40,000 by a year. So the problem is getting even worse. It's like, or the solving the problem is getting worse. So my questions on this is like now, how to have this feminist approach on when we are managing those refugee camps, because as we see the practice of Nepal, or the experiences of Nepal, we have seen like managing the population of Bhutanese refugees takes more than 20 years, and still it is not settled 100% in total. So I think there will have a multiplier incidents or multipliers effects, because they are vulnerable, and those situations are making them vulnerable physically, mentally, even economically, as you have shared also. So there are so many multiple other replications that women has facing, and whenever the solution of the problem is thought of and when put in actions. Always there is these issues are shadowed by other issues in the camps or in those process. So my point of discussion is like, how could we have the feminist approach when we are dealing with such type of incidents? Yes, thank you for a very enlightenment session, ma'am.
Your observations are very important, particularly on Nepal. And let me just add something. You said, how does it fit into a feminist foreign policy? When I have to give examples of what might a feminist approach bring to the area of foreign policy, I often give the example of Nepal, and I leave it open because I'm not sure about it. But let me give you that example, and it deals with the Bhutanese refugees. At a time when I was in Nepal, and this is, I think, 2004 or so, the foreign minister happened to be a woman. And there was the possibility of an offtake of a substantial number of Bhutanese refugees to the US because they required them to do farming. See, you get third country resettlement possibilities when they see that there is a labor possibility for these refugees. So they wanted, in fact, farm labor in the US, and I think it was Australia. And this was being negotiated. But for some reason, there was a problem in terms of giving them an exit permit, because they said, we've looked after them for so long, we really want them to go back to Bhutan. And this is what we've been arguing. This has been our whole, the framework of our dialogue. And we don't, we were not looking for third country settlement. So that was, I remember, and I remember my boss, Tapan Bose, and a Bhutanese refugee who worked with us went, and they talked to her, and they said to her, she refused initially. And then they said to her, do you really want to go down in history as a woman who denied the possibility of 2 more generations of Bhutanese refugees, or who made sure that 2 more generations of Bhutanese refugees stayed in refugee camps rather than had the option to become autonomous, self-reliant citizens? Do you really want to go down in history as the woman who denied them that opportunity of 2 more generations of children who will grow up in refugee camps? She agreed. She gave them the permit to exit. And they were resettled. And these were, I don't now remember, it was quite a while ago, so I don't remember the exact numbers, but that was substantive. And I'm wondering, would that same argument have appealed so much to a man? Maybe. And there are feminist men too. But this whole idea that 2 more generations will grow up in a camp situation. But on the Bangladesh thing, frankly, one is to address and ameliorate the situation of the refugee situation, which frankly, I don't see much scope for, because funds are shrinking, the tolerance levels are shrinking, the problems are becoming more and more acute of 2 generations being born in a camp-like situation. But where I think we can work at is to ensure, to try and see that we make some difference as far as what is happening in Myanmar, to influence, because India has influence. Some of us have been working through the ASEAN process, but India too has influence. And there is no reason why we meaning women's collectives, have never actually banded together to try and at least demand some level of accountability of the extremely close relationship we have with Myanmar, and to leverage that for change in Myanmar. I mean, that's where I see the path forward. But yeah, of course, amelioration of the situation, but you're not going to get any more money. At the moment, it's really quite desperate.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I request Bushra Ali Khanji to ask her question.
Thank you, Fiza. Thank you so much, Ms. Rita, ma'am, for sharing your knowledge and perspectives. It has been, it's been really insightful. My name is Bushra, and I'm a current guest member at the University of Sussex, UK. So my question is around the legislative framework of India's 2015 Asylum Bill and the most recent 2022 Climate Migrant Bill. So while both are, they are like really significant efforts in addressing pressing migration challenges, but neither includes specific provisions that address gender as a critical factor. So there has been, even though there has been considerable criticism surrounding this omission, like from human rights advocates, scholars, and gender-focused organizations, nothing has been done. What you have talked about, everything that you've just discussed, it literally sums up, both the bills, they literally sum up the bottom line of everything. And my concern, therefore, is to understand why this critical aspect has been overlooked for so long. Why is there such an attitude by the governments towards the inclusion of women in refugee policies? This why is something that I really want to know. Is it, for example, is it a reflection of deeper systemic issues within India's policy-making processes, such as, a lack of intersectional understanding, which I don't think, as there is so much strong body of work out there that answers the why of intersectionality, or does it stem from the broader geopolitics of migration and refugee recognition, where gendered considerations often just, they just take a seat back. So it actually saddens me that women migrants and refugees in India are now set to endure, more years and decades of systemic oversight before finally receiving their dues, if of course these bills, like, they ever become laws. That's another process. So yeah.
One, I think it would be helpful if you share perhaps this climate migration bill, because I am not familiar with it. Perhaps others are familiar with it. And if others are familiar, then maybe you can just share it to me, bilaterally. But otherwise, you could share whatever salient issues that you think are relevant. The other is, when you said, why is there so much resistance to, in fact, incorporating gender into refugee policy, and particularly take status determination? Why not GBV? Why not asylum GBV? One of the reasons is because a lot of this within the patriarchal framework is seen as part of private life. We do not, it's only now that we're looking at domestic violence. It's only recently that domestic violence, even sexualized violence, are being seen as political issues in the public domain. So there is some very, very fine writing on that international law frameworks are not gendered. They are not able to deal with the issue of, you used intersectionality to deal with the structural constraints that, in fact, women need to grapple with. And here we're talking about international law frameworks. I think, frankly, it is because so much of these are products of patriarchy. And as we all know, patriarchy invents and reinvents itself and adapts. But on the climate migration thing, I'm just not familiar with that. And I would be very happy if you share it.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I request Sanya ji to ask her question.
Can I just come in on that question? Just as a response, I think it's also to do, this is Janki Andharia speaking, sorry. It's also to do with the fact that fundamentally states tend to be militarized when you're looking at anything to do with refugee issues or international issues, and the whole definition of who can enter a sovereign state, the military comes in a big way. So we do live in a highly militarized sort of context. And I think that also needs to be recognized as, a very major factor, which is going to continuously pose problems with regard to gender sensitivity at all levels. So, I mean, I just wanted to add to what, Rita Manchanda just said, that if you start to unpackage the structural constraints, I think the idea of states being militarized and the military having the power to kind of so-called protect who can come in and who can sort of, who should be pushed out, and therefore who is to be treated as an intruder. I think that that conception is also something that comes into play in a big way. Thank you. Sorry for
no. I think your observation is spot on, but I'm not so sure how I could how you're gendering it. What I would agree with you in totally that the national security orientation of states, the you call it militarization of states, the foreigner, the non-citizen, is always regarded with suspicion. And that here, I don't see this as a woman or a man thing. This is a much more general neutral statement. The foreigner is looked upon as after all, what is an alien? An alien is somebody who is outside our system, and therefore looked upon with some level of curiosity, but also of mistrust. And it is this mistrust which is very much a part of the response to refugees. But I'm not so sure how one would gender this.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I request Sanya ji to ask her question. So, ma'am, the question is, my understanding is that there is immense potential for local feminist activism and encouraging economic self-sufficiency of the refugees. So, I would like to know your views about the ways in which grassroots movements led by deprived gender communities can impact policies related to refugee support systems.
I have to confess that particularly when it comes to the Rohingyas, very few local women's organizations are willing to engage. And they're not willing to engage because they are afraid of getting mired into national security issues. This has always been a major problem with mainstream women's groups. Their reluctance to engage, and here we're not only talking about refugee groups, we're talking about national security issues. Anything that borders onto that, they shy away from, not only because today their FCRA, their right to FCRA and so forth might be compromised. And this is a very real one. I mean, I have watched some of the local organizations, even the recognized implementing partners of UNHCR lose their FCRA. Why? Because they're working with Rohingyas who are seen as threats to national security. So one is this, that, when you're talking about refugees, there is an issue about this, that they're scared. I mean, working with even Afghan refugees, the good refugee, the bad refugee, of course, help. You can work with refugees who are considered good refugees. But even, so these are not without risk. And particularly if you have FCRA and so forth, then you are very, very reluctant to engage with this. Secondly, it's not only at the level of self-reliance, livelihood. A lot of groups and a lot of women groups are involved in legal support, legal aid to refugees. As I said, I myself am part of a petition There is the Arya Trust that is also engaged in these kind of issues. There are N number, Azadi Project too is fighting cases. There are, the Human Rights Law Network. There are many groups like that that are involved. Then the issue that you particularly raised, which is how can we help them in terms of self-reliance? And there are these catering. The Afghans are very good at this, that they have, many of them are involved in catering. And I do know that women have been involved in helping them develop more marketing skills and so forth. So that can be done, but it's not only limited to livelihood, self-reliance, and so forth. It's also legal aid, and legal aid is hugely important, but it's also high risk. And the high risk level is what often dissuades women, local women's groups from getting involved. But the media is another area which is huge because they actually can make the difference.
Thank you so much, ma'am. There's another question from Nimita Pandiji. Could you elaborate on the coping strategies adopted by refugee women to address their needs for social, economic, and emotional support?
One is, of course, their community. But the community also exacts a price. And I do know that there are some young women who say we prefer not to be within the protective sphere of the community, because then we have to dress in a particular way. They watch how we go out. And in fact, many of these women, and that's a coping strategy, many of them work as receptionists in a dental clinic, and you find they walk out of their house and they all live in these very sheltered, networked, webbed communities, like in Bhogal, in Lajpat Nagar, in Malviya Nagar, and so forth, Sunlight Colony. And they walk out of their homes and they change on the way, or they change wherever, and you suddenly find they're transformed. On their way back, they change again. These are all coping strategies because they know that they need to blend in. And often resettlement of women is discouraged because they say they won't blend in. I find the women are the first to blend in, but they need to evolve these kind of strategies of coping. Then, of course, there are these high-risk coping strategies, which are very unfortunate. Like they will send out their children to do rag picking. They will send out they go in for early marriage, to protect their daughters. So, there are all kinds of, and there is sadly transactional processes as well. But many of these women have worked out, they're not always of the same community. There are Christian Afghans, and I found the Christian Afghans did not want to live with the community because they felt threatened. Some did, some had no problems, and some lived separately. So there are also, there are some, because they carry over, and I asked this question of them, do you carry over the ethnic divides that exist in your own country to India, which you regard as your first country of asylum? You carry them over. Some said no, others said yes. So it's a really mixed bag, but they have all evolved. But the community is a very, very important safety net for them because they have no other. And I met women who were actually totally destitute, and it's the community that has provided them succor. They do look after each other because they say we have nobody else.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I request Janki and Dharia ji to ask a question.
Yes, this is a slight departure from maybe what we've been discussing, but I was curious about whether you have any insights to offer on what happens when, as India as a country, or any of the other countries for that matter, when you do disaster response work or disaster relief work and provide humanitarian assistance, we observe that it's typically gender blind. The guidelines are gender blind. So any thoughts on how these can be made more gender sensitive, how women can be more visibilized to those forces that go in to provide response or relief, in a disaster situation?
1 second. I'm not really plugging this, but I am. This journal came out, it's available on the web, and it has an essay on, in fact, disaster management and women in disaster management. That means women working in terms of the disaster management force, uniformed women. And so it, in fact, gives you interesting examples from Nepal. It gives you interesting examples from, of course, what India is trying to develop in their national disaster management strategies. It's a very new area. We know very well that more women die in disasters than men because they don't flee. They cannot flee because they are culturally socialized to look after the elderly and the children. They also, as we saw particularly in the Sri Lanka case, quite a lot of the women refused to leave because they were not willing to take the help of men. They didn't want any physical contact with the men. There was also, so, there are all these kind of issues. These are, but today there is a recognition that you need to have within the disaster management force itself uniformed women who are part of disaster management. You need to have women who are also part of the planning of how to do disaster management. And because they have found, whether it's the Nepal earthquake, whether it is the tsunami, that women suffered. More women died because of this, because of the lack of gender sensitivity in the whole disaster management response. I'm just talking about the immediate disaster management response. I'm not talking about the subsequent relief and rehabilitation issues, which then would come into internal displacement and so forth as well. But do read this essay. It is an interesting essay, and it might provide at least a step forward that within the South Asian context, this is happening.
I have shared the link of Peace Prints. You can download all the back issues and current issue of Peace. It's there in the chat box.
So
I will have to leave now.
Which issue did you mean for us to, which chapter or which author, if you can tell us?
Oh, this is...
Please tell us the title.
One sec. This is, okay, it's called Uniformed Women in the New Wars, but it is on disaster management, and it's by Priyanka Bhide and Ambika Vishwanath.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
And they're part of an organization called Kuberneinen Institute in Bombay.
Yeah. They organize roundtables. Yeah, regular.
Thank you so much, ma'am. There's one last question. I request Mohammed Shafiq Sultanji to ask his question. Mohammed Shafiq Sultanji. So ma'am, he has made a general comment, some questions, and need your suggestion. He needs your suggestion regarding he's an Afghan scholar stranded in India and registered under refugee status with UNHRC, and deeply concerned about the lack of clarity and transparency in the resettlement process. And
well, I have good news for him, because it may not be great news for us feminists, but it's good news for him, which is that the Afghans have got now a person, they have appointed a person, a diplomat in Mumbai, who will be, in fact, he's a former student from South Asia University, Kamil, who was on an ICSSR fellowship. And there is a photograph of him in the Indian Express, I think today. And he's opened this consulate in Mumbai, and recognized by the Taliban. And he will be dealing with the with consular affairs, and particularly with the problems that some of the students are facing. We have, I understand, or at least registered 35,000 Afghan students. So it's not a small problem. And as we also, and the reason I said it's not a great news for feminists is because India is rolling towards soft recognition of the Taliban. Our joint secretary from the Ministry of External Affairs recently traveled to Kabul and met with all the officials.
Yes.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I would like to invite Vibhuti ma'am to kindly share closing remarks for the day.
I think after such a data-driven and exhaustive, nuanced understanding on refugee issues, where Ms. Rita Manchanda, she began with the international refugee law, which consider man as a principal agents of political resistance, and women's concern have been treated as private. So whatever happens in the regular, like in our day-to-day civil society life, private versus public dichotomy, that you see even reflected in the international refugee law. While all refugees have increasingly struggled to secure access to international protection, the efforts to engender international refugee law have also been undermined by use of category called refugee women. Feminist and human rights organizations have documented the particular experiences of girls and women survivors in the gender-based violence and also violence by the state agents. In fact, we have a Arms People Special Power Act, so where we got completely defeated, where even in case of IPKF's role in Jaffna in Sri Lanka and also Kunan Pushpora. In fact, this year there are so many meetings of women's organizations are taking place, and where the women who are now old, who were the victims of Indian Army in that village. So I think most important thing is that the seeking protection or extrapolating the experiences of socio-political context has been a very important exercise which women active on international, transnational solidarity have been doing. The only issue which we have not discussed today is about the standard operative procedures for the aid agency. We know of a big scandal in 2018 where Oxfam UK and Save the Children, international NGOs, and even in certain African countries, UN peacekeeping forces were alleged of sex abuse in aid work. In Congo, in South Sudan, in fact, the massive more than 50 survivors of sexual violence had submitted their testimony. So we also need to bring this issue center stage in any discussions on international relations as well as on the refugee status, and what kind of standard operating procedures that we need to have for the aid agency. In fact, the UK Parliament had a very exhaustive discussion, which was also aired on television. Many of us even watch how the aid agencies had completely tried to just put the issue in a very, very irresponsible way by saying that it was a voluntary. Those who received the aid, they also were willing to have sexual relations. That is the way, I think, generally, most of the time, the accused and the accused of sexual violence always use these arguments. It is a consensual, right from Mathura, we know whether it was a consensual or coercion. So I think that issue still remain to be addressed, even by the feminist movement.
Thank you so much.
Last word, Ms. Rita, on this issue. Aid workers involved in sexual transgression.
You know, the whole issue of peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping, multilateral peacekeeping, I think is a subject for a different lecture altogether and really needs to be done.
Got it.
As a way forward, may I suggest again Peace Prince, which has this wonderful article by Vanessa Farr, a South African, in which she looks at this whole issue of UN peacekeeping. And, even you find the women peacekeepers who are there, they cover up for the men. Because as far as they're concerned, they're part of, it's part of the code. It is part of their code. They will say that there needs to be more gender sensitive training. So when the question then is asked, were there incidents of this kind of abuse? And they said, things happen, and then they move.
That's what Oxfam and Save the Children also said. This happened. No, and it was consensual. Even 9-year-old girl, how can she give a consent? Yeah. Even Ullu knows, no, basic common sense knows that she's a minor.
Then it's purely exploitative. Then it is exploitative completely.
Yeah. And there's no African girls, as which is they are very sexually active and alert on this issue. These are the kind of answers which bosses of Oxfam and Save the Children say to the British Parliament. It was really heartbreaking, and when it makes you cynic. No, who do you trust now? Even those who are in a progressive and revolutionary effort. No, Oxfam started with such a
many humanitarian workers go in with very colonial perspectives. This whole issue of civilizing brown women, gender equality is civilizing brown women.
No, and seeing African women as a human incarnation of lust. What do you mean? Yeah, that's what the Mathura judgment said about the tribal women of this, no, Justice Chandrachud judgment. So the same stereotypes, even after 50 years of international women's movement fighting against gender-based violence, when it happens even in the progressive circle, that becomes very heartbreaking and also disappointing.
But which is why, Professor Vibhuti Patel, I want to sort of flag this, because in many of our sort of presentations, we tend to conclude by saying the way forward is to have more women into something. But I think that alone is not okay, because we are essentializing women and we are saying, once women are there, things will fall in place, which is not the case at all.
Accountability system and transparency.
So I think, yes. And I think therefore, because even if you have more uniformed women, but if they are going to be sort of trained into sort of, falling in line with all the patriarchal systems, then they uphold the system. And so I think we need to have a more nuanced response to this. And I mean, I'm just saying this because we tend to feel or argue that with more women in certain places, everything will be fine. Because but that's not the case. Yeah.
No, fully endorsed. Yeah. Thank you. It was really a very, very.
Okay. Thank you so much, and good night.
Powerful.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So as we have come to the end of this insightful discussion, we conclude the Day 5 session of Feminist Foreign Policy Fellowship, an online international winter school program, a 3-month immersive online introductory leadership certificate training fellowship program. I, Fiza Mahajan, visiting researcher at IMPRI, would like to express my gratitude on behalf of the Asia Foundation, New Delhi, IMPRI, Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies, and IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center, New Delhi. I would like to thank our chair, Professor Vibhuti Patel, and the expert for today, Ms. Rita Manchanda, for taking out their valuable time and their thought-provoking insights on the topic. I would also like to thank our participants for raising important questions and contributing to the thoughtful dialogue that is essential to this fellowship. We look forward to seeing you all on November 22nd for the next session, which will feature Dr. Atiq Noor Alami, Professor Suvarna Rajagopalan, and Professor Swaran Singh. Thank you all for your engagement today. We hope that this fellowship will be a transformative and enriching experience for each of you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Fiza, for conducting the session so well.
Thank you, ma'am.
Seamlessly. Thank you.